What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. We're out in the greenhouse again today, and in today's episode, we're going to be answering a very common viewer question, and that is, what's the difference between a peat moss-based potting mix and a coco coir-based potting mix? So with that being said, let's talk about that now. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is peat moss-based potting mixes. So I've got here a bucket of peat moss-based potting mix. Common examples could be like a sunshine mix or a pro mix. We use them a lot in our garden, and they're great. But there's some reasons that you may not want to use them, and we'll talk about that. But basically, peat moss is essentially a plant that grows in a bog, and they grow in these very anaerobic environments, these wetland environments. And all of this biomass grows up, and then it decays and it falls in on itself, and then it regrows and it falls in on itself, and it creates these thick layers of peat. And basically, it decomposes at a rate that's much slower than, say, compost. So what happens is it actually breaks down much differently, and it allows the plant material to stay fluffy and loose, but not plant-like, right? So it doesn't look like a mulch. It looks more like compost, but it's not actually compost. And that's what makes it really special. And that's also why the agricultural industries for decades have been using peat moss, is because it's an absolutely incredible soil substitute. So it's soilless. There's not actually soil in peat moss. And so it looks a lot like soil, it behaves a lot like soil, but it's not soil. So that's why it's awesome. But what actually goes into a potting mix that has peat moss? Well, the first thing is obviously peat. And so a lot of people don't like to go with peat moss based potting mixes because of the fact that peat is a non-renewable resource in a way. It has become more sustainable in recent years. We've talked about this in the past, that the reason why we use it and the reason why we can confidently use it is because countries like Canada have very strictly regulated the harvesting of peat, as well as kind of research around making it more sustainable. So for the past 30 years, there has been a tremendous effort to making it more sustainable. So that's been great. That being said, though, some people are still in the mindset that it's not the best for the environment, and that's fine. But so there's one kind of negative downside. The other negative downside is that it can be very acidic. And so peat moss will typically have a pH of right around 4.5 to 5, so very acidic. So in order to combat that and make it able to be used in most gardening settings, people that use peat moss will also have to amend their peat moss with things like dolomitic lime. So that's another kind of soil amendment that needs to go in here so that it becomes pH balanced so that all plants can benefit. Otherwise, you would have things like blueberries benefiting, but things like lettuce struggling. And so you definitely need to make sure that you go with something that's been pH balanced. And a potting mix like Pro Mix or Sunshine Mix, ones that we've used in the past, do have dolomitic lime added. Now, the final thing that is typically added to a peat moss-based potting mix is vermiculite and perlite. That's going to be pretty standard across all potting mixes because what that actually provides is additional aeration and prevents compaction. And so that doesn't really, that's not really special to peat moss-based potting mixes, but you're going to find that because if you didn't add it, it would really compact. It would actually dry out, and then it would actually kind of contract in on itself when it dries and become more of like a hard brick that would repel water and things like that. So that's really all that's in a peat moss-based potting mix. Now I want to talk about what makes a coco coir-based potting mix a whole lot different and just another alternative that you can use. All right, so now let's talk about coco coir-based potting mixes. So what we have here is a basically about a 10-pound block of compressed coco coir. Now, what is coco coir? Well, the coconut industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and for decades, they really haven't known what to do with the coconut husks, the actual outside of the coconut and the inside hard nut of the coconut. And so a lot of times they would just basically send it off to a landfill, or they would kind of mulch it down and apply it as a mulch underneath the trees to hopefully kind of return some of the nutrients back to the crop so that they could grow more coconuts. About 15, 20 years ago, a company started to compress them into blocks, and then that started to take off, and gardeners used to actually line their hanging baskets, which was kind of a novel way. Rather than use sphagnum peat, again, they turned to coconut fiber, and this was really wispy strands of coconut. Then the industry actually decided to start mulching it up even finer into what they called coco peat. And coco peat, or coco coir as it's called, is essentially a finely ground coconut fiber that acts and behaves just like soil, but it's peatless. And so it's a wonderful peat substitute because it behaves in almost the same exact way that peat moss does, without some of the negative downsides. So really fun fact for you guys. If you're looking at this block of compressed coco coir here, you might be thinking, how many coconuts go into this 10-pound block? Well, this 10-pound block represents about 40 coconuts in this block of coco coir here. So 40 coconuts goes into this. And if you're looking at this and thinking, that's a lot of coconuts, that doesn't even scratch the surface as to how many coconuts are produced globally every single year. If you had to guess, what would be your guess? Throw it down in the comments box down below. Just curious. I'll wait. Did you guess 138 billion pounds of coconuts? That's incredible. How many pounds of coconuts are generated every single year? And a lot of that is waste, because coconut fat, like coconut oils and stuff like that, or coconut meat or coconut milk, make up a very small percentage of the actual coconut itself, the weight of the coconut. Most of it is just bulk. Most of it is literally just fiber. And those fibers now can be repurposed as a byproduct and used in your garden, which is really, really cool. So I'm gonna show you guys how you can rehydrate this, and then we're gonna talk about, as we're kind of making a coconut coir potting mix right here, we're kind of gonna talk about some of the benefits of it. So these can be fully hydrated by themselves if you wanna make a ton of, expanded coco coir, but you don't always have to use all of it. At MIgardener.com, we just started carrying this because a lot of you wanted another, just another thing that you can add to your garden, a substitute to peat moss, and so we decided, why not carry it? And so we got these 10-pound blocks here. The really cool thing is that you can absorb about 16 to 17 gallons of water in this block here, and it will make roughly about 2.5 cubic feet of actual expanded coco coir. Or what you can do is to get a shovel, and when they compress these, they compress them in what's called sheets. And you can see the sheets, they're kind of just like layers. And if you were to come in here like this, incredibly, incredibly hard. However, if you turn it on its side and wiggle a shovel in between one of those sheets, they peel right off, which is awesome. And so you can actually use smaller amounts, so you don't have to rehydrate everything all at once. The side is kind of the kryptonite of coco coir blocks. All right, so we're going to rehydrate some of this here, and then once it's rehydrated, which will take about 4 to 5 minutes to fully rehydrate, once it's rehydrated, then I'll show you what you have to do next. All right, so what I'm doing is basically the process of what's called washing the coco coir. Now, there's a lot of upsides to using coco coir, but there's also some downsides as well. I'm not gonna pretend like there aren't downsides. There's downsides to everything you use, right? If you use peat moss, there's downsides in the fact that it may not be as environmentally friendly. But if you use coco coir, there's some downsides as well, in that there can be some salt content. And the reason why is because coco coir is produced in countries that don't have access to a lot of fresh water. And so it's a luxury here in the United States where we can just turn on a tap and get fresh water. And most of our industries use fresh water because of the fact that salt content can kind of mess things up a little bit. Now, when you're talking about the coco coir blocks are used, they use water to compress them, and that's how they get such a tight block like that. And unfortunately, what water they have? Well, they have salt water, they have seawater. And so countries like the Philippines, like India, Southeast Asia, they all have access to seawater, but not a lot of fresh water. And so when they make these blocks, some of that seawater does actually kind of penetrate the fibers of the coconut husk fiber. And if you're unaware, salt is really not great for plants. Plants don't like salt that much. And so what you need to do is you need to wash the salts out. And it's very simple. All I'm doing is I'm just rehydrating the coconut husk fiber in about 2 times as much water as I would normally use to hydrate. So let's say I thought I would need about 2.5 gallons of water. I fill it up to 5 gallons, about double the amount. And then what I'm gonna be left with is basically a slurry of coconut fiber that's all rehydrated. And when I pull it out, it's not done yet, but when I pull it out, I'm gonna take it out and I'm going to squeeze it. And when I squeeze it, all of that water is going to leave, and with it is going to leave a lot of the salt content. Now you can double wash. There's people that recommend triple washing. People that are very, very hyper conscious of the salt content, people that grow hydroponically or other industries, the other herb growing industries really is hyper conscious about salt contents and things like that because they can kind of mess up nutrient uptake and stuff when growing hydroponically. But in the garden, a teeny tiny little bit of salt's not going to mess you up too much. So single washing is fine by me, but if you need to, you can also if you feel like you need to, you can also double wash, but it's basically just the same process, just doing it all over again. And so that's one of the negative kind of downsides to using coconut husk fiber, but there aren't many. Another upside, though, to using coconut husk fiber is the fact that it's pH balanced. So we talked about with peat moss is not pH balanced. You need to add things like dolomitic lime to basically increase the alkalinity so that it becomes not so acidic. Well, with coconut fiber, it's basically a pH of 7, and so it makes it really great, especially for those growing hydroponically, but also growing in the garden, starting seeds and things like that. There's a lot more that you can grow in cocoa fiber without having to amend it because it already starts out as kind of a pH of neutral, which is awesome. Another benefit to coconut husk fiber is the fact that obviously with the entire block here, this entire block, 10-pound block, is basically 11 inches by 11 inches by about 4.5 inches. And so you can get a ton of bang for your buck because basically an entire 2.5 cubic foot bale of peat moss really can't be compressed down all that much. There's a lot of sponginess in that material, and so you can compress it down a little bit, but you're still probably looking at a 2-foot long block by maybe a 1.5 long block. It's a huge, heavy, bulky block to get about the same yield. Granted, this one you have to hydrate, this one you have to wash, but look how much less space it takes up. So there's a lot of benefits to using coconut husk fiber, and I'm not going to sit here and say that it's better than peat moss. That's just my personal opinion. You can have your own personal opinion, and I think that they're both great. On MIgardener, we believe that, at MIgardener, we believe that giving you alternatives is what gives you the ability to make decisions. If I say this is the only thing you can use, it kind of pigeonholes you into only one option, and that's not so fun. So I like to give people options. So I'm not going to say that it's better or worse. It has its pros, it has its cons, and I really like it. So take it for what it's worth. All right, so one quick little tip here when rehydrating your coco coir is using warm water. Now, if you just use freezing cold water, it will work just much, much slower. And so if you need it in a pinch and you don't want to just let it sit there all day for 20, 30 minutes to watch it rehydrate, I mean, you can just set it and forget it and come back 20, 30 minutes later. But if you need it in a pinch and you need it quickly, you can use warm water and it'll speed up the process by like twice as fast. All right, so it's been about 10 minutes and we got most of the coco coir absorbed. And so now all we're gonna do, like I said, is we're gonna take it, we're just gonna squeeze out all that excess water because all of that salt is going to wash away with it. And we're left with a beautiful, fluffy growing medium. Now, there's a lot in here. If I'm gonna fill up this bucket here to use as an example, I'm probably not going to have enough room, so I'm not gonna use it all, but I'm gonna show you guys. I mean, this thing, it just keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming. And we use maybe about 25% of that block. So you get an incredible yield from very, very little coco coir, which is awesome. But it's the never-ending bucket of coco coir. But we're just gonna take it and kind of press it out, make a coco coir ball and throw it at you. It holds its shape really well, but what tells you it's good quality is that when you apply some pressure, it does just kind of crumble. So it doesn't actually hold its shape. It doesn't kind of clump together like heavy soil would. So we're gonna do one more and then we're gonna run out of room here. So get all that water out. And now we're left with hydrated coco coir. Now again, there's still a ton in here. So we have here a bucket of expanded coco coir, and what we need to do now is we need to amend it so that it has the same qualities as a peat-based potting mix. And so in order to amend it, remember, because this is pH balanced, we don't need to add things like dolomitic lime, but we do need to add things like perlite and vermiculite for the moisture holding capabilities of the vermiculite and the also the nutrient holding capabilities of the vermiculite, as well as the kind of aeration and fluffiness of the perlite. So let's add those. All right, so we have the coconut husk fiber in here. It's all hydrated. Now the next thing we need to do, like I said, is we need to add the perlite and the vermiculite. Now in a really good mix, like if you look at this peat-based potting mix, you'll notice that about 25% of the overall volume is perlite and about 15% of the overall volume is vermiculite. And so what you want to do is, like, let's say this container here, I mean, I don't know, it's, well, actually there's measurements right on it. So like 4 liters, right? So if you had 4 liters, 25% of 4 liters would mean I need about 1 liter of perlite in this mix here. And then I'm going to need roughly, you know, whatever 15% of 4 liters would be. It doesn't have to be exact. Don't get so stressed out and worried about exact measurements, but just roughly 15% of that should be vermiculite. And that's going to really provide the ultimate amount of moisture holding capabilities, nutrient holding capabilities, as well as the aeration from things like perlite. And so again, just 25% of the overall volume should be perlite, 15% roughly should be vermiculite, and then the rest should be made up of the coco peat. And then we're going to mix this all up here. And what you'll see is that it's just a super simple mix, very, very lightweight. It is, you know, not clumpy. There's no sticks. There's no chunks. It's just very, very nice. And it will work great as not only a seed starting mix, but also a potting mix. A lot of people even will fill raised beds and stuff with it because it is so inexpensive, and you know, it really does expand and you get a lot. But there you go. It's that simple. And again, this will look a little bit different than the peat-based because the company that produced this used something more like a medium grade perlite, not a fine grade perlite. There is some fine in there, but the larger chunks of perlite is definitely medium grade. It would look slightly similar if I went with a medium grade, but I like to go with a fine grade when possible, just because I use it in not only a seed starting mix, but also a potting mix. But it's that simple. Now the final thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to add some type of fertility. Now we go with trifecta. This is trifecta. Now trifecta is our fertilizer of choice. You use what you want. You know, on this channel, I don't force you to do something. I simply give you recommendations. We use trifecta because it's a slow release organic based fertilizer. It's not certified organic, but it's intended for organic gardening. So it's going to be more of a slow release fertilizer. There's not going to be a lot of, you know, heavy synthetic chemicals and things in it. But depending on how you grow, we'll decide what type of fertilizer you go with. If you want to go with a 10-10-10, go with a 10-10-10. If you want to go with something organic like this, go with something organic like this. But the idea is that you do need to provide some type of nutrients to these mixes. Regardless if you're going with a peat-based mix or a coco coir-based mix, you need some type of nutrients. Otherwise, your plants are not going to have anything to take up, to grow with. So if you're growing something like lettuce, they're going to need nutrients. If you're growing something like a tomato, they're going to need nutrients. Nothing you're growing is going to be fine in either of these without nutrients. And that's really what sets this aside from something like compost. But one of the reasons why you don't use compost here is because if you're growing some like indoors, it's really difficult to get compost indoors without some of the fungus, some of the mildew, some of the, you know, the molds and things like that, but also a lot of the pests that come in compost. The nice thing with these is these are very sterile. They're soil-less. That means there's no soil in them. So they behave like soil without some of the negative downsides of soil. Once you obviously move outside, that's really where compost can kind of bump elbows with both of these. And I'd prefer compost over both of these in an outdoor setting because you're outdoors, there's natural predators, anything like mold and mildew, there's good airflow. There's a lot of good regulatory things that kind of keep mold and mildew and pests at bay that indoors, these excel. Outdoors, they all are kind of even at the end of the day. So, and compost you can make yourself. These you end up going and buying. So I prefer these for things like seed starting mixes or you know, just potting mixes in general. But you know, take this information and use it for some way to help you grow big in the garden, I hope. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. As always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger.